Is an appearance still an appearance when the apparatus that makes it trembles? Plato would have suspected the question from the start. In the cave, appearance is already suspect, already fallen, already a shadow cast by something more real than itself. But a holographic near-eye display makes the old hierarchy harder to trust. The image is not a painting of an object. It is a controlled wavefront, a physical arrangement of light that arrives at the eye as if it had come from depth. If it succeeds, it does not merely show a depth cue. It gives the eye a reason to focus. It produces an optical event that the body reads as spatial. That is why this project does not begin with entertainment. It begins with ontology, under vibration. What kind of thing is a virtual object, if the smallest motion inside the optical train can make it blur, speckle, or drift out of validity? Hans Blumenberg saw modernity as an age that learned to live by self-assertion in a world no longer guaranteed from above. The instrument had to replace the old cosmic assurance. The telescope, the microscope, the camera, the screen, each one said, trust this constructed window. Trust the device. The hidden bargain was that the device would remain stable enough for trust to make sense. Prolog asks what happens when that bargain fails at the scale of the eye. A benchtop hologram can look clean because the optical operator, the mathematical relationship between the modulator, the mask, the optics, and the pupil, has been measured once and treated like a law. But a worn device is not a cathedral wall. It bends, it warms, it shifts against skin. The spatial light modulator moves by a hair. The scatter mask moves by less than a hair. The relay optics breathe with temperature. The pupil is not a fixed port in a machine. It is living tissue, moving inside a moving face. Suddenly, the image is not being judged by the ideal operator. It is being judged by the operator of this instant. So, the philosophical question sharpens. Is the hologram an image, or is it a negotiation? If it is an image, then it can be calibrated, packaged, and sold as though the world will hold still. If it is a negotiation, then its truth is not in the first reconstruction. Its truth is in its capacity to keep reconstructing itself while the conditions change. A sharp friend across a table would say it more plainly. A great hologram in a lab is not enough. The question is whether it can stay great when it is strapped to a head. That is the native problem of Prolog. It is not trying to prove that disorder can expand ay-tahn-doo on a stable optical bench. That line of work already exists. It is not trying to recover an image through tissue. That line of work also exists. It is asking whether a disorder-based holographic near-eye display can track its own optical drift while in use, estimate a compact correction to the current scattering operator from sparse feedback, and solve the hologram against the operator that exists now, not the operator that existed during calibration. This is why appearance cannot be treated as lesser being here. The appearance is the engineering endpoint. The artifact is not a philosophical embarrassment, it is the evidence. When the corrected reconstruction remains clean under injected drift, the apparatus has not created a fake thing. It has preserved a relation. It has held a contract between light, hardware, computation, and eye. And if the contract fails, it fails visibly. Speckle, blur, defocus, temporal shimmer. That is the mercy of optics. It does not let a weak claim hide forever in language. The image confesses. The science ahead answers the opening question by refusing Plato's easy dismissal. An appearance made of light can be rigorous, but only if it survives the movement of the world that produces it. Nicholas of Cusa would have called this a problem of learned ignorance. The more exact the instrument becomes, the more it reveals that knowing is never simply possession. It is proportion. The mind knows by relation, by a measured approach to what exceeds it. A holographic display makes this strangely literal. The image is not a solid thing placed before the eye. It is a proportional achievement, a wavefront shaped so the eye receives the right relation of focus, angle, and intensity. Change the proportions inside the apparatus, and the object loses its authority. That is why the phrase valid reconstruction matters. It is colder than beauty. It asks whether the image still answers to the physics that claim to produce it. A virtual object can be beautiful and invalid in the way a lie can be elegantly phrased. It can appear for a camera at one pupil position and fail for an eye somewhere else. It can pass a demo and fail a wearer. Validity is the sterner category. It means the reconstruction holds under the conditions named by the claim. The project therefore belongs to a family of modern problems where the object is less important than the control loop that preserves it. A drone is not autonomous because it once knew where it was. It is autonomous because it keeps estimating where it is while wind and sensor noise disturb it. A language model is not useful because it once held a context window. It is useful only as long as the next token remains conditioned by the right state of the conversation. A holographic near-eye display is not robust because a lab operator once measured its optical path. It is robust only if it can keep its image tied to the optical state it has now. This is not a metaphor for the mechanism. It is the mechanism seen at a higher register. Prolog treats the hologram as the visible end of a state estimation problem. The thing the user sees is downstream of something the device must infer. The display has to ask, what machine am I at this instant? The answer cannot be romantic. It has to be computable. That is where the adversarial engine enters. A program director will not be moved by the poetry of appearance. The director will ask for the operator. The director will ask for observability. The director will ask what data separates drift from content. The director will ask what happens when the estimator is wrong. The philosophical question survives only if it can pass that cross-examination. So hold the opening question tightly. It is not decoration at the beginning of a technical talk. It is the whole proposal in compressed form. If appearance depends on a changing apparatus, then the apparatus must become self-correcting enough to keep appearance valid. That is the difference between an image that merely appears and an image that endures. The temptation, especially in display technology, is to hide philosophy behind specifications: field of view, eye box, contrast, latency, resolution, speckle, focal depth. Those words are necessary. They are not enough. Beneath them is the same question every instrument faces: when does mediation become trustworthy? A telescope mediates the star, a microscope mediates the cell, a holographic display mediates a world that is not physically there in the ordinary sense, yet must be optically convincing enough that the body treats it as spatial. Blumenberg's lesson returns here with force. The modern instrument does not ask to be believed because it is sacred. It asks to be believed because it can be tested. Prolog's opening claim should therefore never be mystical, even when the language of hidden operators and disorder feels almost occult. The display is trusted only to the degree that its correction loop can be falsified, measured, and made to fail in public ways. The image is not protected by wonder. It is protected by metrics. This is the bridge between the YouTube artifact and the pitch defense. The general listener needs the awe of a machine that can turn a scrambled optical field into depth. The applicant needs the discipline to say, awe is not the claim. The claim is a compact operator correction recovered from incomplete feedback inside a named drift envelope. The same lecture has to carry both. It must make the image strange enough to remember and exact enough to defend. That double demand is why Prolog's best philosophical frame is not illusion. Illusion suggests the image succeeds by deceiving. Holography succeeds by constructing the right physical cues. A bad illusion survives ignorance. A good hologram survives measurement. The program director will not ask whether the floating image feels magical. The director will ask whether the current optical operator was identified, whether the held-out scenes improved, whether the correction finished before the frame budget expired, and whether the speckle remained below the pre-registered limit. So the first answer to Plato is almost severe. The appearance is not lower because it is made. It is lower only if the making is uncontrolled. When the making is disciplined by operator estimation, physical drift models, feedback, and perceptual metrics, appearance becomes a site where truth is tested rather than evaded. The hologram is not an escape from matter. It is matter made accountable to light. That is why the word prologue fits better than it may first seem. A prologue stands before the main drama and teaches the terms by which the drama should be read. This project is not the final headset. It is the prologue to a class of head-worn holographic systems that may one day present depth with less compromise. It teaches the optical machine how to read itself before asking the user to trust what it shows. The stricter academic version of the question is this: a near-eye holographic display is not only an image synthesis problem, it is a problem in the stability of a physical forward model. The calibration does not merely describe the device in a casual sense. It defines the operator that maps a commanded phase pattern at the spatial light modulator into a complex optical field at or near the pupil. When that operator is wrong, the display is not suffering from a small software error. The reconstruction is being solved for the wrong instrument. That distinction matters because it prevents the lecture from becoming product theater. The research does not ask whether a viewer likes a virtual image. It asks whether a holographic system can maintain a valid optical reconstruction when the operator that made the first reconstruction possible has drifted. In formal language, the display begins with a calibrated operator, then experiences a time-varying perturbation induced by mechanics, temperature, vibration, and pupil motion. The task is to infer enough of that perturbation from incomplete observations to keep the displayed field close to the intended field. That is, an estimation problem, a control problem, an inverse problem, and a perception problem, all collapsed into the narrow physical space in front of an eye. So the word appearance now carries more technical weight. An appearance is not a surface. It is the result of a constrained inverse solve against a particular optical state. It is made out of phase, amplitude, propagation, diffraction, scattering, aperture sampling, and biological acceptance. If any one of those terms moves outside tolerance, the eye does not receive a philosophical debate. It receives blur. This is why the project document's language about a calibration survival layer is central. The research claim is not that the bench display is beautiful. The research claim is that the system can estimate a compact correction to its current scattering operator from sparse feedback, update a drift state, and resolve the hologram within a display rate budget. The whole lecture has to keep returning to that sentence, because that is where the fundable mechanism lives. The lineage begins long before the headset, with the old suspicion that vision is never passive. In Euclid's optics, vision was treated geometrically, as a problem of rays, angle, and apparent size. Later thinkers corrected the physiology, but the deeper inheritance remained. To see was to be caught inside a geometry. What changed across centuries was not the desire, it was the machinery. The medieval cathedral window is not a hologram. It should not be treated as one, but it belongs to the history of disciplined appearance because it made light do theological work through material constraint. Colored glass, lead, stone, sun angle, and ritual time formed an apparatus. The image changed with the day. It was stable enough to teach, unstable enough to feel alive. Chartres did not solve wavefront control. It did something older. It made optical experience a memory device. The Renaissance memory arts took the same instinct inward. Giulio Camilo's memory theater, described in the 16th century, promised that knowledge could be arranged spatially so the mind could walk through it. The point was not decoration, the point was retrieval. Bind an idea to an image, bind the image to a place, and recall becomes almost architectural. That is the same mnemonic structure a technical lecture needs when it has to prepare an applicant for a hostile pitch call. The apparatus of memory and the apparatus of optics meet in one demand. The structure must hold under pressure. Then the dream becomes scientific. Christian Huygens gave wave theory its great 17th century form, describing every point on a wavefront as a source of secondary waves. That sentence, spoken without formulas, is already the seed of holography. If you can shape the wavefront, you can shape what the eye receives. If you can shape what the eye receives, you can create the optical conditions of an object that is not materially present. Dennis Gabor named holography in the 20th century while working on electron microscopy. The word carries the Greek ambition of whole writing, a way of recording not merely intensity, but the structure of a wave. Then lasers made coherent light practical. Then spatial light modulators turned wavefront shaping into something dynamic. Then near-eye displays forced the old dream into an unforgiving package. The problem became intimate. The apparatus had to sit on the face. The esoteric echo is tempting, but it must be disciplined. Alchemy did not secretly invent holography. Hermetic thinkers did not possess hidden wave optics. What they did possess was a symbolic grammar for transformation through hidden order. Matter appeared confused, base, mutable. The work was to discover the operations by which it could be refined. A disorder-based holographic display has a scientific version of that grammar. The scatter mask looks like corruption. It scrambles light. But if the operator is known, the disorder becomes a tool. The scrambled medium is not an enemy, it is a coded partner. That is the lineage Prolog inherits, not mysticism as explanation, mysticism as a historical reminder that many cultures imagined hidden order before they could measure it. The modern claim must be measured, not invoked. The scatter mask is not magical because it scatters. It is useful only because its action can be characterized, corrected, and used to reconstruct. The present field already knows that disorder can help expand ay-tahn-doo. Scattering-based expansion showed that a static mask could break the old trade between field of view and eye box, supporting dense imagery when paired with better algorithms. Learned optical elements later showed that ay-tahn-doo expansion could be optimized rather than hand-guessed. Phase mask analysis showed that not all disorder is equal, and that some simple structures can rival or exceed random masks. Pupil-aware holography showed that the eye itself, by sampling different parts of the field, can turn a display that looks good to a camera into one that fails for a user. Prolog enters after these moves. That matters. The pitch is not a first claim that scattering exists. It is a survival claim. It asks whether the measured operator can remain useful when the system is no longer the system that was measured. In the old cathedral, stone held the window. In the headset, skin holds the optical bench, and skin is not stone. The old dream was to make light obey. The new problem is more severe. Make light obey while the command language itself is changing. The next decisive turn is Fourier optics, because it taught engineers to think of lenses and propagation not as mysterious image makers, but as transformations of spatial frequency. A lens can be read as a machine that rearranges angular information. A holographic display lives inside that grammar. The object is encoded not by ordinary drawing, but by shaping the distribution of phase so propagation performs the drawing later. A spatial light modulator does not paint a horse at depth. It shapes a field from which the eye can receive the optical evidence of depth. That is also why ay-tahn-doo became the bottleneck. The term belongs to radiometry and optical design, and it carries the product of area and angular spread. In plain language, it is the space angle budget of a display. A near-eye holographic display wants a wide field of view, a comfortable eye box, and a compact form factor. But the modulator has finite resolution, and finite resolution bounds how widely it can diffract light. The old dream of making light obey runs into a hardware economy. You can spend the budget on field of view, you can spend it on eye box. You can try to keep the device small. You cannot pretend the budget is infinite. Scattering-based expansion made a brilliant inversion. Instead of treating scrambling as a defect, it used scrambling as a way to redistribute the light. If the mask's action is known, disorder becomes a high-dimensional optical tool. That is the lineage from wavefront shaping. In one domain, researchers focus light through opaque or turbid media by learning how the medium scrambles the field. In the display domain, the scramble is not an accident in tissue or fog. It is inserted on purpose so the display can reach angles the modulator alone cannot reach. This distinction must be kept clean. The historical connection is real, but the use case changes the obligation. In imaging through scattering media, success often means recovering information from behind or within disorder. In a display, success means producing a desired image through an engineered disorder element. The direction of desire is reversed. One side asks, what object is hidden by the medium? The other asks, what input should create the object I choose after passing through the medium? The occult lineage offers one last mnemonic if it is handled without superstition. The alchemical vessel was a container in which transformation had to be maintained under heat, time, and contamination. The vessel mattered because the process mattered. Prolog's vessel is the optical train. It is under heat too, but here, heat is not symbolic. It is a perturbation to alignment, optical path, and calibration. The old image of a vessel under fire becomes a memory hook for a real engineering fact. Thermal drift is not atmosphere. It is part of the test envelope. So the lineage ends in a narrow question. Holography learned to write with waves. Wavefront shaping learned to use disorder when the disorder is known. Ay-tahn-doo expansion learned to exploit masks and learned optical elements to widen the possibilities of near-eye display. Prolog asks the next question in the chain. What if the known disorder becomes slightly unknown during use? The 20th century added another shift. Once computation entered holography, the hologram became less like a plate and more like a problem solved repeatedly. Computer-generated holography asks what pattern will produce the target field after propagation. The answer depends on the model of propagation. If the model is wrong, the pattern may be mathematically sincere and optically false. That is the exact weakness Prolog exploits. The computation can only be as current as the operator it trusts. The spatial light modulator is the emblem of that computational turn. It gives the system a changing surface, a way to write a wavefront over and over. But it does not remove the physical limits of the surface. Pixel pitch, fill factor, modulation depth, refresh behavior, and optical efficiency all matter. Ay-tahn-doo expansion is born from that mismatch between computational desire and modulator constraint. The computer can imagine a wide, angular field. The hardware has to diffract it. This is why disorder became attractive. A scattering mask can create angular diversity that the modulator alone cannot. But disorder is a bargain, not a gift. It increases possible spread while making reconstruction dependent on a complex mapping. The system wins only if it knows the mapping well enough to invert or optimize through it. In old language, the labyrinth becomes useful only after it has been surveyed. Prolog's lineage is therefore not a straight line from magic to optics. It is a sequence of increasingly disciplined mediations, geometry disciplined sight, wave theory disciplined light, holography disciplined wavefront recording, spatial light modulators disciplined dynamic control, scattering masks disciplined disorder. Prolog tries to discipline drift. The lineage also has to include a quieter mathematical inheritance. Holography begins with the fact that a light field carries phase as well as intensity, and the difficulty is that ordinary detectors mostly see intensity. Computer-generated holography turns that old recording problem into a synthesis problem. Instead of capturing the interference pattern from an object that already exists, the system computes a modulator pattern that should produce the desired wavefront after propagation through a known optical system. The word known is the hinge. Fourier optics gave display engineers a language for thinking about apertures, spatial frequencies, diffraction angles, and transfer functions. Adaptive optics gave astronomers and microscopists a language for correction, where a distorted wavefront could be measured or inferred and then counteracted. Wavefront shaping through scattering media added a stranger lesson, that disorder is not simply noise if the mapping through the disorder can be learned or exploited. Modern neural and camera-calibrated holography then added optimization machinery using measured propagation models, learned optical elements, and gradient-based solvers to improve image quality. Prolog inherits from all of those lines, but it does not disappear into any of them. It takes the disorder-friendly instinct from scattering-based holography. It takes the in-the-loop correction instinct from camera-calibrated and wavefront shaping systems. It takes the pupil sensitivity problem from near-eye display work. Then it changes the target. The goal is not merely to make a wider field or a cleaner static projection. The goal is to keep the forward model alive after the optical train ceases to behave like the optical train that was calibrated. That is why the old dream of making light obey becomes a modern problem of making the instrument answer back. In the 19th century, the apparatus was often treated as the silent servant of observation. In the present problem, the apparatus is too active, too fragile, too close to the body to be silent. It must become a participant in its own correction. Imagine the bench first, because the bench is the seduction. A laser is aligned, a spatial light modulator sits where it should, a scattering or diffractive mask is fixed with care, a feedback camera watches the reconstruction, the transmission behavior is measured, the hologram is solved against that measured operator, the image appears, it has width, it has depth, it has the almost theatrical shock of seeing disorder produce order. Now, remove the bench and put the same logic on a human face. The room is warmer, the frame flexes when the strap tightens, the optics shift when the user raises an eyebrow, the pupil moves, the display warms from operation. A sub-pixel displacement, too small to feel and easy to ignore in a product story, is not small to a coherent optical system. The field has memory of alignment, the operator has changed, the hologram is still being computed as if nothing changed. That is where the clean reconstruction begins to rot. Not because holography is fake, because holography is precise. A fixed calibration is a promise made at one moment. A worn device asks that promise to hold across thermal shift, mechanical flex, vibration, face fit motion, lateral mask or modulator shifts, angular shifts, pupil equivalent offsets, and thermal-like sweeps. The Prolog pitch names those perturbations directly. Lateral shifts of 1 to 50 micrometers, angular shifts of 0.1 to 2.0 milliradians, pupil equivalent offsets of 0.1 to 1.0 millimeters. Thermal-like sweeps across 20 to 45 degrees Celsius. Those are not marketing adjectives. They are a drift envelope. The project lives or dies inside that envelope. The cost of failure is not only a lower score on an optical metric. For a user, the cost is uglier. A virtual object that should sit at depth begins to look uncertain. Fine texture breaks into speckle. Edges soften. Focus cues become less trustworthy. The eye is asked to believe a spatial claim the light no longer supports. That is not a minor defect for AR, VR, and MR. It is the difference between imagery that the visual system can inhabit and imagery that the visual system has to forgive. The commercial consequence is equally plain. Headset makers and optical module developers want correct focus cues, large field of view, compact optics, and an eye box that does not punish small natural motion. But conventional non-holographic displays often give up the full promise of natural focus. Bench-bound holography gives the promise but not the product condition. Rigid packaging tries to make the device behave like a bench. Periodic recalibration admits the bench was gone and tries to summon it back between failures. None of those answers solves the most irritating version of the problem, which is the one that happens while the image is in use. A simple statement carries the whole market pain. The user does not care that calibration was correct this morning. The user cares whether the image is correct now. This is why the pitch positions Prolog as a calibration survival layer rather than a consumer headset. That distinction is important. If the project claimed to build and sell a headset in phase 1, a program director would hear product overreach. If it claimed full-color industrial design, content deployment, power optimization, and headset sales, the research question would blur into a startup wish list. The pitch excludes those things. The beachhead is an IP-backed method, a validation dataset, and a reference integration package for display teams evaluating disorder-based holography under realistic drift. That is not less ambitious, it is more defensible. It says the first product is not the dream object. The first product is the missing layer that makes the dream object less fragile. The vivid scene is this. A prototype sits on a lab table, but the lab table has been taught to misbehave like a head. An actuated stage nudges the mask. A thermal sweep changes the optical state. The pupil channel shifts. Held-out scenes are displayed. The old fixed calibration begins to fail. The Prolog loop watches sparse feedback, estimates the compact correction, updates the drift state, and resolves the hologram. The question is not whether the first image was beautiful. The question is whether the second image, under drift, stays below artifact limits. That is the problem. Bench beauty is cheap compared with worn survival. There is also a perceptual cost that a purely optical diagram can hide. Near eye displays fight the accommodation and vergence problem because the eye wants focus cues and binocular depth cues to tell a coherent story. Holography is attractive because it can, in principle, present wavefronts with correct focus information rather than merely placing flat imagery behind stereoscopic tricks. But that promise makes drift more serious, not less. If the display claims to provide natural focus cues and then its reconstruction breaks under motion, the betrayal occurs at the level of the visual system's trust. A flat screen can be forgiven for being flat. A holographic display is judged by the depth it claims. This is why speckle is not a cosmetic issue. Speckle is coherent light reminding the user that the apparatus has not fully disciplined its interference. Some speckle can be tolerated. Too much speckle becomes a perceptual noise field. Blur weakens the edge in the focus plane. Defocus makes the virtual object feel optically unmoored. temporal artifact adds a new kind of unease, because the image may not merely look wrong, it may look wrong in time, crawling or pulsing while the estimator chases a moving target. The industrial pain follows the physics. A headset company can build a prototype that impresses investors under controlled conditions. That does not answer the optical module team's harsher question. What happens across users with different face geometry? What happens after warm-up? What happens after vibration? What happens when the pupil moves to the edge of the eye box? What happens when the device is not handled like lab equipment? The practical world is a drift generator. Prolog's insistence on a bench rig is therefore not a retreat from reality. It is a way to make reality repeatable. Real head-worn use is messy. A Phase 1 project needs controlled access to that mess. The actuated drift stage allows the team to impose known perturbations and compare the estimator's inferred correction with intermittent full characterization. Without that discipline, every success could be blamed on favorable conditions and every failure could be dismissed as an anecdote. A program director may ask whether the drift envelope is realistic. The applicant's answer should be measured. It emulates head-worn use through named perturbations, lateral mask and modulator shifts, angular shifts, pupil equivalent offsets, and thermal light sweeps. It does not claim to exhaust all wearable conditions. It creates a controlled envelope where the survival mechanism can be falsified. That is the right scope for Phase 1. The market consequence is that Prolog sells evidence before it sells spectacle. Optical module teams do not need another cinematic promise of immersive worlds. They need to know whether a disorder-based holographic architecture remains computationally governable after the operator shifts. If yes, they can evaluate licensing, integration, and module design. If no, the field learns that this particular survival path is weaker than hoped. Either answer is more valuable than another polished demo under fragile conditions. The problem is therefore not simply movement. It is the mismatch between the time of calibration and the time of perception. Calibration happens in one state. Seeing happens later, under another state. Prolog is the attempt to close that temporal gap. There is a second concrete scene. A display engineer has a reconstruction that looked strong on Monday. By Friday, after repeated thermal cycles and small mechanical adjustments, the same calibration produces artifacts that seem to come and go. The team can tighten the mount, repeat calibration, and choose more forgiving demo content. Those actions may rescue the demonstration. They do not solve the scientific question. The device has revealed that its optical identity is conditional. That is the difference between engineering around a problem and researching the problem. Engineering around drift means making the package stiffer, choosing scenes that hide failure, recalibrating often, or narrowing the use case. Researching drift means asking which parts of the operator changed, which changes can be observed from feedback, which corrections matter perceptually, and which failures are unavoidable under the proposed architecture. Prolog chooses the second path. For AR, the stakes are sharper, because virtual content must coexist with the physical room. If a virtual object floats on a desk, the eye compares it with desk edges, hand motion, head motion, lighting, and expectation. Error has neighbors. In VR, the world is generated, but the body still detects optical strain. In MR, the system has to negotiate both. A drifting holographic reconstruction is therefore not an isolated defect. It is a crack in the contract between the display and embodied perception. This is why the initial customer list is sensible. Headset makers, optical module developers, and immersive platform builders are the groups that feel the bench-to-worn gap directly. They do not need a philosophical lecture to know the pain. They need a method that can be integrated, tested, licensed, and compared against their own internal baselines. Prolog has to meet them as a technical layer, not as a finished consumer myth. The engineering problem should be stated in the hard language of tolerances. A scatter-based or diffractive mask can expand ay-tahn-doo, because it redirects and redistributes angular content in ways a plain spatial light modulator cannot. But that benefit is purchased by sensitivity to the exact mapping between modulator coordinates, mask structure, relay optics, and pupil sampling. A lateral shift of the mask is not just a cosmetic displacement. It changes which local scattering response each modulator region addresses. An angular shift changes phase relationships. A pupil offset changes which part of the reconstructed field is sampled by the eye. A thermal sweep changes physical dimensions and refractive behavior. The project document gives the drift envelope, and it is the spine of the lecture's problem section. Lateral mask or modulator shifts run from 1 to 50 micrometers. Angular shifts run from 0.1 to 2.0 milliradians. Pupil equivalent offsets run from 0.1 to 1.0 millimeters. Thermal light sweeps run from 20 to 45 degrees Celsius. Those are not cinematic catastrophes. They are ordinary deviations for something worn on a human head. This is the brutal part. A consumer does not need to know any of that. The eye simply notices that the image is wrong. The display team, however, has to know which wrongness is informative. Is the degradation caused by scene content that is hard to reconstruct, by speckle from coherent illumination, by pupil sampling, by sensor noise, or by a true physical drift of the operator? If the estimator confuses those causes, it can chase the scene instead of the instrument. Then the correction loop becomes a machine for stabilizing its own mistakes. The problem is therefore not motion in the broad sense. It is causal separation under incomplete observation. The system has to distinguish the drift of the apparatus from the desired complexity of the image. That is the academic core, hidden underneath the accessible phrase, calibration decay. Think of the display as an orchestra, where one section is deliberately chaotic. The spatial light modulator is the player that can change its instructions quickly. It shapes the incoming coherent light. The scatter or diffractive mask is the strange player. It scrambles the light in a way that looks destructive until you know its pattern. The relay optics carry the result. The pupil samples it. The eye receives the reconstruction. On the bench, the conductor has a score. That score is the measured optical operator. It says, when this input field hits this modulator and passes through this mask and this relay and this pupil configuration, this is what comes out. Once that relationship is known, computation can work backward. What modulator pattern should be shown so that after the mask scrambles it, the desired image appears? The catch is that the score changes when the instrument moves. The ordinary answer is to make the instrument rigid, or to stop and recalibrate, or to accept a worse display. Prolog proposes a different answer. Do not pretend the score is fixed. Estimate how it has changed while the music is playing. The mechanism has 4 acts. First, the system begins from an initial calibration because it is not trying to escape physics. It needs a starting model of the operator. Second, it shows content and receives sparse feedback from an imaging channel. That feedback is incomplete. It is not a full transmission matrix remeasurement. It is a few clues under time pressure. Third, the estimator asks which compact drift state best explains the error between the expected reconstruction and the feedback. Is this consistent with a lateral mask shift? Is it consistent with an angular change? Is it pupil related? Is it scene-dependent image error masquerading as drift? Fourth, the system updates the correction and solves the next hologram against the current operator. The key phrase is current operator, not original operator, not ideal operator, current operator. The pop culture analogy that fits is not a superhero suit or a magic mirror. It is a rival. Denis Villeneuve's film about learning a language that does not behave like the one you brought into the room. The alien script in that film is not a line moving from start to finish. It is circular, relational, whole. The human task is not to translate word by word. It is to learn the grammar of a form whose meaning appears only when the whole structure is understood. A drifting, scattering operator is not alien language, but the analogy lands because the failure mode is similar. If you assume the grammar is fixed, you misread the message. Prolog is a grammar tracker. It asks, what is the optical language at this instant, and how do we write the hologram in that language before the next frame is due? Say it plainly. A fixed holographic display says, the machine I measured is the machine I have. Prolog says, the machine I measured is the ancestor of the machine I have, so I need to track the difference. That difference does not have to be the full difference. This is the intelligence of the pitch. A full operator is too large to remeasure at display rate. A full inverse solve may be too slow. The project therefore bets on compactness. It bets that the drift relevant to image failure can be represented by a smaller set of degrees of freedom, enough to predict and correct the reconstruction without remeasuring everything. If that bet is right, the loop becomes possible. The display does not need to know the whole universe of scattering anew at every instant. It needs to know the change that matters. A program director will hear that and immediately press on observability. Sparse feedback is not a magic oracle. Scene content confounds the signal. Speckle confounds the signal. Pupil position confounds the signal. Sensor noise confounds the signal. That is why the pitch is research rather than integration. The estimator has to learn what can be known from incomplete evidence and what cannot. The mechanism, first pass, is therefore simple but not shallow. Measure the system. Let the system drift. Watch small feedback. Infer the compact drift correction. Update the operator, resolve the hologram, keep the image valid. The old magic trick was disorder producing a clean image. The harder trick is disorder continuing to produce a clean image after the disorder has moved. A second analogy comes from the prestige, but only if the mechanism is kept exact. In the film, the audience sees the effect and mistakes the effect for the secret. The real structure lies in the hidden duplication, the cost paid outside the frame. A holographic display has a similar temptation. The viewer sees the floating image and thinks the secret is the image. It is not. The secret is the operator that lets computation write the right wavefront before the eye receives it. Prolog's claim is that the secret must be maintained, not merely discovered. The first calibration is the pledge. The feedback loop is the sacrifice that keeps the pledge from decaying. Every frame carries the risk that the machine has shifted enough to invalidate yesterday's solution. The sparse feedback channel is the witness. It does not see everything. That is crucial. If it saw everything at full resolution with no latency cost, the research problem would soften. The feedback channel sees enough, or it does not. It gives the estimator a partial confession from the image. The estimator then asks which physical drift state most likely produced that confession. This is why the word blind has force. Blind does not mean ignorant. It means the system does not receive a clean, direct measurement of the full operator each time. It must infer from indirect evidence. It begins with a calibration, watches deviations, and updates a compact model that is closer to a physician reading symptoms than to a mechanic holding a part in hand. The symptom is not the disease. The image error is not the drift. The estimator has to infer the drift from the symptom while avoiding false diagnosis. A weak version of this idea would simply optimize until the image looks better on the feedback camera. That is not enough. It could overfit the current scene. It could improve one plane while damaging another. It could create temporal instability. It could make a camera happy while the eye remains unhappy. Prolog's loop has to remain tied to physical drift and perceptual quality, not merely to instantaneous image improvement. So the first pass mechanism can be restated in human terms. The display learns the character of its own misalignment. It does not learn misalignment in general. It learns the small family of ways this optical train stops being itself under use. Then it changes the hologram so that after the new misalignment acts, the eye still receives the intended reconstruction. That is why the mechanism belongs in a pitch phase defense. It is narrow enough to test and deep enough to matter. It makes a bet about the structure of drift, the sufficiency of sparse feedback, and the speed of incremental correction. Those are research bets. They can lose. The story of cause and effect can be made even more concrete. Begin with a desired image. The solver chooses a modulator pattern based on the calibrated operator. The pattern enters the optical train. The mask scatters it in a structured but complex way. The relay optics guide it. The pupil samples it. The reconstruction appears. Then the mask shifts slightly. The solver still chooses a pattern for the old operator. The pattern enters a new optical train while believing it has entered the old one. The output is wrong. Prolog inserts a question between error and the next pattern. What changed? Not, how do we make this one feedback image prettier? What physical correction to the operator best explains the deviation? The next pattern is then solved for the corrected operator. The loop repeats as the device continues to drift. This is why the phrase re-solve matters. The system is not merely applying a visual filter after the image is bad. It is changing the hologram before reconstruction, so the optics themselves produce a better result. A filter works after the image. A hologram correction works before the light has become the image the eye receives. That distinction is crucial. The display is more like a musician retuning while playing than a video editor fixing footage after capture. A retuned instrument changes the next note at the source. Prolog's correction changes the next wavefront at the source. The ear hears pitch. The eye receives light. In both cases, the correction must happen before perception judges the error. There is also a control theory intuition. A fixed calibration is open loop with respect to drift. It sends commands based on an old model and hopes the plant remains the same. Prolog adds feedback and state estimation. The plant, in this case, is the optical train. The state is the compact drift condition. The controller updates the command so the output remains close to the target. That is the plane control story. But the optical details make it hard because the plant is high-dimensional, coherent, speckled, and sampled by a moving pupil. That is why the mechanism cannot be reduced to ordinary stabilization. The display is not only keeping a camera pointed in the right direction. It is keeping a computed wavefront valid through a changing scattering transformation. Stabilization of geometry is not enough. The phase relation has to be respected. In a more rigorous first pass, the mechanism has 4 verbs: probe, infer, update, reconstruct. Probe means the system obtains sparse feedback that is informative about the current optical state without spending the time or measurement budget required for a full transmission matrix. Infer means the estimator uses that partial evidence to recover a compact representation of drift rather than a full, high-dimensional optical operator. Update means the system changes its internal forward model from the bench operator to the current operator. Reconstruct means the hologram is solved against that current operator, not against the old one. The phrase compact correction is doing serious work. The project is not promising to remeasure the entire optical system every frame. That would be too slow, too data-hungry, and possibly impossible inside a wearable path. The bet is that the physically relevant drift lives in a smaller subspace than the full scattering matrix. Mechanical translation, angular tilt, thermal sweep, pupil offset, and a limited class of aberrational or alignment changes may be expressible with far fewer parameters than the full operator. If so, the feedback does not have to identify everything. It has to identify the degrees of freedom that matter for reconstruction quality. The narrative version is still useful. A pianist can recover when the piano goes slightly out of tune only if the pattern of wrongness is structured. If every string changed independently at random, the performance would collapse. Prolog's technical wager is that the optical instrument, under head-worn drift, is not random in that impossible sense. It is wrong in ways physics constrains. Those constraints are what make estimation possible. That is why the mechanism should never be described as artificial intelligence sprinkled on optics. The intellectual center is model-based. Learning or optimization may help, but the defense has to be built around observability, parameterization, drift priors, feedback scheduling, and reconstruction metrics. The system succeeds only if the correction corresponds to the apparatus, not to a hallucinated improvement in the image. Now the soft version is over. The hard question is this: what exactly is being estimated? A holographic display can be narrated as a chain of operators. The spatial light modulator imposes a controllable phase or amplitude pattern on coherent light. The scatter or diffractive mask transforms that field through a complex mapping. Relay optics propagate it. The pupil samples it, and the intended image is not produced by drawing pixels. It is produced by choosing an input wavefront, whose downstream transformation yields the desired intensity distribution at one or more target planes. In scattering-based ay-tahn-doo expansion, the mask is valuable because it redistributes angular content. The limited spatial resolution of current dynamic spatial light modulators restricts diffraction angle, and that restriction creates the trade between field of view and eye box. A scattering element can spread light into a wider range of angles, but it extracts a price. Once the light is scrambled, useful reconstruction depends on knowing the scramble. The mathematical object behind that scramble is the operator. In a fully characterized system, one could imagine a large, complex transmission relationship connecting input modes to output modes. For each candidate modulator pattern, the operator predicts what field arrives at the reconstruction plane or at the sampled pupil. In practice, the full object is far too large and too slow to refresh under ordinary display timing. That is why Prolog's technical claim cannot be, "We will remeasure the full transmission matrix whenever the user moves." That would concede the display rate problem. The claim is smaller and stronger. The system estimates a compact correction to the current scattering operator. Compact means the update is not trying to relearn every optical interaction from zero. It assumes that drift during use lives in a lower dimensional family, tied to physically meaningful perturbations, lateral mask or modulator shift, angular shift, pupil equivalent offset, thermal light change, mechanical flex. These perturbations change the operator, but not in arbitrary ways. A lateral shift induces structured changes in phase and sampling. A pupil offset changes which region of the field is admitted. A thermal sweep can alter alignment or optical path in a way that evolves continuously. The estimator's task is to identify the coordinates of drift that explain the feedback. That is the observability question. Given sparse measurements, can the system distinguish true physical drift from image content error? If a bright edge in the scene produces a reconstruction artifact, the estimator must not decide that the mask moved. If speckle appears because of coherent interference, the estimator must not chase noise. If the pupil shifts, the system must not interpret it as a modulator shift unless the data support that. The feedback schedule therefore matters. The project cannot rely on arbitrary content alone. It needs probing strategies or embedded feedback moments that expose operator change without ruining the user experience. The pitch does not claim the full answer in advance. It names the research. Phase 1 will determine which operator degrees of freedom are observable from incomplete feedback, how to separate physical drift from scene-dependent image error, and whether an incremental update can run fast enough without full transmission matrix remeasurement. There are 3 baselines that make the mechanism scientifically legible. Fixed calibration is the naive baseline. It says the bench operator is still valid. Periodic remeasurement is the brute force baseline. It says the system can sometimes return to fuller characterization, but not continuously at display rate. Offline camera in the loop is the privileged baseline. It can be accurate because it is not bound by the same timing and product constraints. Prolog must beat fixed calibration under drift, approach the useful correction of stronger baselines, and stay inside the display rate budget. That budget is 33 milliseconds after initialization for each operator update plus hologram correction. 33 milliseconds is not ornamental. It corresponds to display relevant timing. If the correction comes after the perceptual damage, it is not a correction in use. It is a post-mortem. The go or no-go logic is equally strict. Objective 1 requires the estimator to recover a compact operator correction with normalized prediction error no more than 0.20 against intermittent full characterization on held-out drift states, without using held-out scenes for fitting. That phrase does a lot of work. Held-out drift states prevent the estimator from merely memorizing the perturbations it saw. Held-out scenes prevent it from exploiting scene content. The metric asks whether the correction predicts the optical behavior that full characterization later confirms. Objective 2 asks whether the closed loop has value under time pressure. After initialization, the update plus hologram correction must complete within 33 milliseconds on the Phase 1 compute stack. The corrected reconstruction must improve held-out drifted scenes by at least 3 decibels in PSNR, or reduce normalized mean squared error by at least 25% relative to fixed calibration. This is the part of the pitch a program director can grip. It is not simply, the image looks better. It is a named improvement against a named baseline under a named timing budget. Objective 3 asks whether the cure creates a new disease. A tracker can restore geometry and still produce shimmer. It can reduce one error while increasing temporal artifact. It can chase drift so aggressively that the image becomes unstable. The pitch therefore requires closed-loop reconstruction to maintain structural similarity index at or above 0.85, or a pre-registered optical reconstruction metric, while residual speckle contrast and temporal artifact measures remain below pre-registered perceptual limits. The phrase pre-registered matters because it refuses after-the-fact rescue. The project should decide before testing what counts as unacceptable speckle and temporal artifact. Otherwise, any result can be reinterpreted as success. The one level deeper technical issue is identifiability under confounding. Sparse feedback gives an error signal, but that error can be explained by several causes. The drift state model must impose physical structure, otherwise estimation becomes a hall of mirrors. The feedback schedule must excite the right degrees of freedom, otherwise the estimator will be blind. The update rule must be incremental, otherwise it will miss the timing budget. The hologram solver must accept the corrected operator, otherwise tracking remains a diagnostic rather than a display mechanism. So, the architecture is not one invention. It is a loop whose pieces only matter together. Drift, state representation, feedback schedule, estimator update rule, hologram resolve, validation against held-out drift and held-out scenes. Remove any one piece, and the novelty collapses into familiar work. A sharp friend version is this. The display keeps a live estimate of how its own optics have shifted, then computes the next hologram for the shifted machine, not the remembered machine. That is the mechanism Prolog has to prove. Not a better mask by itself, not a prettier hologram by itself. A calibration survival loop. There is another subtlety. The corrected operator must be useful for hologram synthesis, not merely predictive as a diagnostic. A model can predict that the reconstruction will degrade and still fail to generate a better pattern in time. The estimator and solver therefore have to be co-designed. The drift state representation should expose degrees of freedom that the hologram optimizer can use efficiently. A physically meaningful but computationally awkward correction may pass a characterization test and fail the display. This is where the 33 millisecond budget disciplines the entire architecture. It compresses the space of possible algorithms. A rich, non-convex solve that requires too much iteration is not a display loop. A heavy full matrix update is not a display loop. A correction that requires stopping normal content too often may not be an in-use method. The phrase display relevant rate is an engineering razor. It cuts away ideas that would be acceptable in offline optics but useless in a worn display. The feedback schedule also has to balance information and intrusion. If the system inserts probes too often, the user may see the calibration process. If it inserts too few, the estimator may become blind. If it relies only on natural content, some scenes may be uninformative. A dark, low-texture scene might hide drift. A highly structured scene might create ambiguities. The research needs to identify feedback moments that carry operator information without turning the display into a diagnostic instrument the user has to watch. The drift state representation is the place where optics and applied mathematics meet. A naive representation tries to learn arbitrary changes in a giant operator. That is too expensive and too underdetermined. A stronger representation uses physical priors. Lateral shifts, angular shifts, pupil offsets, and thermal trends do not perturb the operator randomly. They create structured changes. Those structures allow a smaller parameter set to stand in for a much larger optical transformation, but physical priors can also mislead. If the real bench drift includes coupling between modes that the compact model excludes, the estimator may look stable while leaving important artifacts uncorrected. If thermal change creates deformation rather than a simple shift, a shift-only model may fail. If the pupil moves and the mask shifts at the same time, the feedback may not separate them cleanly. That is why Objective 1 has to include multiple held-out drift states, not merely one perturbation at a time. The strongest version of the Phase 1 experiment would test both isolated and combined perturbations. Isolated perturbations teach the estimator the signature of each drift mode. Combined perturbations test whether those signatures remain separable when the world behaves more like a headset. The source pitch names the drift envelope. The project plan should use that envelope to build a ladder of difficulty. The reconstruction metrics also need hierarchy. Prediction error against full characterization evaluates operator tracking. PSNR and normalized mean squared error evaluate reconstruction improvement against fixed calibration. Structural similarity, or the pre-registered optical metric, evaluates image structure. Speckle contrast and temporal artifact evaluate display usability. No single metric owns the truth. Each watch is a different failure. That is the deep mechanism. A live operator model constrained by physics, updated from sparse feedback, computationally cheap enough for display timing, validated against held-out drift and held-out scenes, judged by optical and perceptual metrics. The novelty is not inside one word. It is inside the coupling of all those constraints. The second pass is where the lecture has to become technical enough to survive a program director. Think of the calibrated display as a forward operator called H sub 0 in speech that maps a candidate modulator pattern into a predicted field at the reconstruction plane or pupil. During use, the true operator becomes H sub t. Prolog's estimator does not try to recover every entry of H sub t. It represents the difference between the old operator and the current operator through a compact drift state, which may include translation, tilt, pupil offset, thermal coefficients, and low-rank correction terms. The inverse problem can be spoken without equations. The solver chooses a hologram that, when passed through the estimated current operator, should produce the desired target field or image metric. The estimator chooses a drift state that makes the predicted measurements match sparse feedback. The two tasks are coupled. Better operator estimates improve hologram correction. Better designed feedback patterns improve operator estimates. A weak implementation would treat these as independent modules. A rigorous implementation treats them as a closed loop with latency, noise, and stability constraints. Observability is the first mathematical danger. Some drift modes may create similar image errors under a given set of scenes. A lateral mask shift and a pupil offset, for example, might both degrade contrast or move speckle in partially confusable ways. The phase one question is not whether a neural network can reduce error on a training set. It is whether the proposed feedback schedule contains enough information to separate the physically relevant drift modes on held-out drift states. That is why intermittent full characterization matters. It gives the experiment a way to test whether the compact correction corresponds to the actual operator, rather than merely fitting the visible scene. Computation is the second danger. A full inverse solve might be accurate while missing the display rate by an order of magnitude. A cheap update might run quickly while tracking the wrong state. The project document sets the timing budget at 33 milliseconds after initialization for the operator update plus hologram correction. That creates an architectural preference for incremental updates, warm starts, adjoint style gradients, pre-computed bases, reduced order models, and parallel hardware execution. The algorithm has to act like a scientist when measured and like an embedded system when timed. The third danger is perceptual. Optical metrics are necessary but not sufficient. Speckle contrast, temporal shimmer, defocus, and image instability can defeat a system whose average error looks improved. The correction loop, therefore, cannot optimize a single static quality number in isolation. It needs regularization across time, held out static and dynamic scenes, and perceptual thresholds that prevent the estimator from buying geometric correction at the price of temporal ugliness. This is the core academic sentence. Prolog is a reduced order, blind estimation and control layer for a time-varying scattering operator embedded in a holographic near-eye display, constrained by sparse feedback, display rate computation, and perceptual reconstruction limits. If that sentence is too heavy for the opening, it belongs here. This is where the project earns its difficulty. Because this is a project pitch and not a completed paper, the evidence section has to be brutally clean. There are proposed measurements, there are go or no-go thresholds, there are baselines, there are failure modes, there are no completed phase one results in the source document. That absence is not a weakness if it is handled correctly. A pitch is not expected to contain finished phase one data. It is expected to contain a research plan sharp enough that failure would be informative. Prolog does this by making three claims falsifiable. First, the drifting operator can be identified from incomplete feedback. The experiment uses a bench rig with a spatial light modulator, a fixed high-resolution scatter or diffractive mask, an imaging feedback channel, and an actuated drift stage. The drift stage is the honesty device. It prevents the project from relying on vague, real-use language. The system will inject lateral mask or modulator shifts from 1 to 50 micrometers, angular shifts from 0.1 to 2.0 milliradians, pupil equivalent offsets from 0.1 to 1.0 millimeters, and thermal like sweeps from 20 to 45 degrees Celsius. Those ranges define the battlefield. The estimator must recover compact operator correction with normalized prediction error no more than 0.20 when compared against intermittent full characterization on held-out drift states. The source also requires that held-out scenes not be used for fitting. That matters because a weak estimator could learn scene-dependent artifacts and call them drift. The test denies that escape. Second, the correction loop must close at display relevant rate. The experiment compares the incremental blind update against fixed calibration, periodic remeasurement, and offline camera in the loop baselines. This is exactly the right family of baselines because each one represents a possible objection. Fixed calibration asks whether the method helps at all. Periodic remeasurement asks whether a less continuous calibration strategy is enough. Offline camera in the loop asks how much quality is available when computation is allowed to be slower and less product constrained. The go or no-go threshold is severe. After initialization, each operator update plus hologram correction must complete within 33 milliseconds on the phase 1 compute stack. The reconstruction must improve held-out drifted scenes by at least 3 decibels in PSNR. or by at least 25% normalized mean squared error reduction relative to fixed calibration. The word relative is important. If fixed calibration is already fine under a mild drift state, improvement may be hard to show. If fixed calibration collapses under severe drift, improvement may be easier, but the image may still be unusable. That is why Objective 3 exists. Third, image cleanliness must survive continuous re-estimation. The pitch names the central risk. Tracking can restore geometry while creating temporal artifacts or residual speckle that make the display unusable. That is the right fear. A system that constantly corrects itself can become visually nervous. The user does not care whether the estimator is mathematically elegant if the image crawls. The go or no-go threshold is that closed-loop reconstruction must maintain structural similarity index at or above 0.85, or a pre-registered optical reconstruction metric, while residual speckle contrast and temporal artifact measures remain below pre-registered perceptual limits. Again, the source is careful. It allows a pre-registered optical reconstruction metric because the right metric for a holographic near-eye display may not always be a conventional image score, but it does not permit the team to invent a metric after seeing results. What can the data show if Phase 1 succeeds? It can show that the compact drift representation is observable under the proposed feedback. It can show that the update plus correction fits within the timing budget on the Phase 1 compute stack. It can show that corrected reconstructions beat fixed calibration on held-out drifted scenes while staying below artifact limits. That would be a meaningful research result. What can it not show? It cannot show that Prolog is a finished headset. It cannot show field durability in a consumer wearable enclosure because the pitch excludes a wearable enclosure. It cannot show full-color industrial design or power-optimized operation because those are excluded. It cannot show headset sales or content deployment. It can produce the calibration survival layer and the validation data needed for display teams to judge whether disorder-based holography can tolerate motion. A program director will respect that boundary if it is said without flinching. The applicant should never inflate Phase 1 into a product launch. The defensible sentence is, Phase 1 proves or rejects the calibration survival mechanism under a controlled head-worn drift envelope. It does not claim to deliver a consumer headset. The evidence from prior work frames why these measurements matter. High-resolution scattering-based ay-tahn-doo expansion showed that static masks and improved algorithms can support dense photorealistic imagery on a bench, including large improvements over older baseline methods. Pupil-aware holography showed that changing eye pupil size and location can produce severe artifacts if the display does not account for how the eye samples the field. Neural ay-tahn-doo expanders showed that learned optical elements can expand ay-tahn-doo substantially and improve fidelity over hand-engineered approaches. Large ay-tahn-doo dynamic Fourier modulation showed another route, combining multiple coherent sources with content adaptive modulation in the Fourier plane. Those are not Prolog's results. They are the terrain. Prolog's evidence must be judged by the gap they leave open. Static expansion and learned expansion are powerful, but the pitch's question is calibration survival under operator drift during use. If the data answer that question, the project has a defensible technical identity. If the data do not answer it, no amount of general holographic excitement will save the claim. The evidence section, then, is a contract with failure. Objective 1 can fail because the operator is not identifiable from incomplete feedback. Objective 2 can fail because the loop cannot run at display relevant rate. Objective 3 can fail because the image remains perceptually insufficient even after tracking. These failures are not embarrassing. They are clean. A clean failure is a research result. A vague success is not. The evidence plan should also produce negative knowledge. Suppose the estimator works for lateral shifts but fails for thermal-like sweeps. That is not a total fog. It tells the company which drift modes are observable and which require hardware sensing, better probes, or a different representation. Suppose correction improves PSNR but increases speckle contrast. That says the solver is optimizing the wrong visual objective. Suppose the loop meets 33 milliseconds only on a high-end GPU and not on the intended Phase 1 compute stack. That says the business story cannot yet move toward embedded integration. A good Phase 1 plan is not only a path to success, it is a diagnostic tree. The intermittent full characterization step is central. It is the ground truth anchor against which the compact correction can be judged. Without it, the system might appear to improve output while estimating a drift state that has no stable relation to physical change. With it, the team can ask whether the compact model predicts what the richer characterization reveals. This is how the project prevents the estimator from becoming a black box that wins only by visual coincidence. The held-out scenes matter in the same way. A hologram solver can be secretly content-dependent. It might learn that certain test images have certain error patterns, then fail when the content changes. The pitch's internal content driver, Pulchritude's generative film and multilingual localization pipeline, makes this even more important. Future immersive content is not a small set of static calibration targets. It is moving, varied, multilingual, cinematic, and visually dense. If Prolog is to serve that future, it cannot pass by overfitting to a few friendly images. The held-out static and dynamic scenes, therefore, should be chosen to stress different visual regimes: fine edges, smooth gradients, high contrast patterns, low texture areas, depth changes, motion, scenes that aggravate speckle, scenes that expose temporal shimmer. The source does not list the scene library, so the lecture cannot invent one as fact, but the design implication is clear. The validation set must punish overfitting. The same discipline applies to perceptual limits. Speckle contrast and temporal artifacts must have thresholds before testing. If the thresholds are chosen after results, the experiment becomes theater. Pre-registration creates trust. It says the team is willing to be judged by a rule written before the outcome. The strongest evidence would be a matrix of conditions. Rows would be drift modes and drift magnitudes. Columns would be baselines and correction methods. The entries would include prediction error, timing, reconstruction quality, speckle, and temporal artifact. The protocol forbids a spoken table, but the applicant should carry that table in mind during the call. The director may never ask to see it at pitch stage, but the answers should sound as if it exists. The source also identifies what each failure means. Failure in Objective 1 means the drifting operator is not identifiable from the proposed feedback. Failure in Objective 2 means the method cannot run at display relevant rate. Failure in Objective 3 means tracking is possible but perceptually insufficient. Those are exemplary failure statements because they do not collapse into "we need more work." They name the broken link. This gives the applicant a disciplined way to speak about risk. Not all risk is equal. Some risk is scientific and worth funding. Some risk is sloppy scope. Prolog should emphasize the first and exclude the second. A wearable enclosure, consumer product user interface, full-color industrial design, power optimization, headset sales, and content deployment are outside Phase 1. That exclusion protects the research from dilution. The evidence that must exist, then, is not a collection of attractive images. It is a chain of proof. The operator changed. The estimator inferred a compact correction. The correction predicted held-out characterization. The loop finished in time. The corrected hologram beat fixed calibration. The image stayed clean enough under perceptual limits. Break the chain, and the claim breaks with it. The evidence section has to become sharper because Phase 1 is not a demonstration of taste. It is a set of killable claims. The first claim is identifiability. The drifting operator has to be recovered from incomplete feedback with normalized prediction error, no more than 0.20 against intermittent full characterization on held-out drift states. The words held out are crucial. Without held-out drift, the system can memorize the bench. Without held-out scenes, it can confuse image content with optical state. The second claim is rate. After initialization, the operator update plus hologram correction must finish within 33 milliseconds on the Phase 1 compute stack. This is not a decorative performance number. It defines whether the technique belongs to display operation or only to offline calibration. A method that corrects beautifully after several seconds may be useful as a laboratory diagnostic, but it does not prove in-use calibration survival. The third claim is reconstruction cleanliness. The closed loop must improve held-out drifted scenes by at least 3 decibels in peak signal-to-noise ratio, or by a 25% normalized mean squared error reduction relative to fixed calibration. It must also maintain structural similarity at or above 0.85, or another pre-registered optical reconstruction metric, while keeping residual speckle contrast and temporal artifact measures below perceptual limits. This evidence stack is stronger because it attacks 3 failure surfaces at once: physics, computation, and perception. A rigorous slide and lecture cannot hide the baselines. Fixed calibration is the most important baseline because it represents the current bench confidence failing under motion. Periodic remeasurement is the brute force alternative. Offline camera in the loop optimization is the high quality but slow comparator. The incremental blind update has to earn its position between them. It must be better than doing nothing, faster than full remeasurement, and more relevant to in-use operation than offline optimization. The most defensible phrasing is therefore not "the system will work." It is "the system is designed so that each necessary premise can fail in public." If the estimator cannot identify the drift, Objective 1 fails. If the update cannot run at display relevant rate, Objective 2 fails. If the image remains perceptually dirty, Objective 3 fails. This is exactly the kind of structure a serious Phase 1 pitch needs. A skeptical program director will not ask whether Prolog sounds interesting. That is not the job. The question will be sharper. Who already did this, and why is your version not the same idea in a different costume? Start with holographic near-eye displays themselves. Andrew Maimone and collaborators helped establish the promise of holographic near-eye display prototypes for virtual and augmented reality, including variable focus cues and compact optical architectures. The broad claim that holography can support richer depth cues is not new. It is field context. Then come the ay-tahn-doo limits, A spatial light modulator has finite pixel count and finite pixel pitch, which constrains diffraction angle. That creates the trade between field of view, eye box, and display size. This is the pressure that pushed the field toward ay-tahn-doo expansion in the first place. If Prolog cannot state that pressure clearly, it cannot claim the space. Grace Kuo, Laura Waller, Ren Ung, and Andrew Maimoni introduced high-resolution ay-tahn-doo expansion for holographic displays using scattering-based expansion. Their work matters because it takes the same counterintuitive move Prolog inherits, add a scattering mask, then compute through it. The mask spreads light in ways the modulator alone could not. With the right algorithms, dense imagery becomes possible rather than only sparse spots. Their reported improvement over baseline methods is a major prior art point, not a footnote. That work stops where Prolog begins. Its central achievement is not in use operator survival under head-worn drift. It treats the mask and optical train as a characterized system. Prolog's pitch is not a scattering mask can expand ay-tahn-doo. The pitch is, when the characterized system changes during worn use, a blind estimator can track compact correction and keep reconstruction valid. Next, Sagi Monin, Aswin Sankaranarayanan, and Anat Levin analyzed phase masks for wide ay-tahn-doo holographic displays. That line matters because it weakens a naive romance of randomness. Disorder is not automatically best. The field has already compared random masks with structured phase masks and found that simple available phase masks can perform strongly. A program director could ask, why not choose a better static mask instead of building a drift estimator? The answer cannot be because Prolog is more advanced. The answer must be mask choice and calibration survival are different axes. A better mask can improve the nominal operator, but the pitch attacks what happens when the operator changes after characterization. The tilting cascade work also belongs in the map. It seeks wider ay-tahn-doo through hardware architecture, using tiltable layers to increase angular range. That is a different structural answer. It changes the display's angular capacity through device construction. Prolog does not propose tiltable pixels or cascade architecture. It proposes a calibration survival layer for disorder-based holography under drift. Then pupil-aware holography. Pranith Chakravarthula and collaborators showed that large ay-tahn-doo holographic displays reveal a severe practical issue. The eye pupil samples the holographic field, and variations in pupil size and location can cause artifacts. Their method optimizes holography while accounting for the pupil. This is close enough to make the program director lean forward. Pupil variation is also in Prolog's list of confounds. So what is different? The answer is that pupil-aware holography addresses robustness to pupil sampling in the hologram optimization problem. Prolog includes pupil-equivalent offsets inside a broader operator drift envelope and asks for blind-in-use operator tracking from incomplete feedback. The point of novelty is not simply awareness of the pupil. It is the live estimation of a changing optical operator across multiple physical drift modes. Then, neural ay-tahn-doo expanders. Ethan Tseng and collaborators present learned ay-tahn-doo expanding elements, with strong results for ultra-wide-angle high-fidelity holographic display. This is serious prior art because it offers a learned optical element rather than a hand-designed one, and reports large ay-tahn-doo expansion with high-fidelity full-color holograms for complex scenes. A director may ask whether Prolog is merely a software wrapper around learned expanders. The answer is no. A learned expander can improve the static or nominal optical element. Prolog's research question is whether the current operator can be tracked after the optical train drifts during use. Then content adaptive dynamic Fourier modulation for large ay-tahn-doo three-dimensional holographic display. That work combines multiple coherent sources with content adaptive amplitude modulation in the Fourier plane and uses pupil-aware gradient descent-based computer-generated holography supervised by a large baseline target light field. It is another strong answer to ay-tahn-doo expansion. But again, its structural emphasis is expansion architecture and hologram optimization, not blind survival of a drifting disorder operator inside a worn system. Now move sideways into wavefront shaping and imaging through scattering media. Guide star-assisted wavefront shaping, transmission matrix methods, and guide star free image-guided wavefront shaping all prove that scattering can be controlled or exploited. Tomer Yemeni and Ori Katz showed guide star free image-guided wavefront shaping for wide-field non-invasive imaging through highly scattering layers. The source pitch names that lineage. It also names the separation. Those methods recover or improve imaging through scattering media. Prolog keeps a projected AR, VR, and MR hologram valid, while its own optical train drifts. That difference is not cosmetic. In tissue imaging, the target is to see through a scattering medium. In Prolog, the scattering element is part of the display. It is not an obstacle outside the apparatus. It is an engineered participant whose usefulness depends on calibration. The task is not to discover an object behind disorder. The task is to maintain a desired optical reconstruction through controlled disorder as that disorder shifts. The honest prior art map therefore contains 6 families: holographic near-eye display prototypes, scattering-based ay-tahn-doo expansion, phase mask and tilting cascade approaches, pupil-aware holography, learned ay-tahn-doo expanders and dynamic Fourier modulation, wavefront shaping and guide star free imaging through scattering media. Nothing should be hidden from the program director. Hiding strong prior art makes the applicant sound fragile. Naming it precisely makes the novelty smaller but harder. The applicant's posture should be calm. Yes, scattering-based expansion exists. Yes, pupil-aware optimization exists. Yes, learned expanders exist. Yes, guide star free wavefront shaping exists. Prolog stands on that terrain and asks the unattended question: can the display survive the fact that a worn optical operator is not fixed? There is also a commercial prior art layer, even when the source pitch does not name companies one by one. Conventional AR and VR displays use waveguides, pancake optics, liquid crystal displays, microorganic light emitting diode panels, projection engines, and other non-holographic approaches. They are real competitors because they can be packaged, manufactured, and improved along mature engineering curves. Their weakness, from Prolog's viewpoint, is not that they are primitive. Their weakness is that many do not deliver the full combination of natural focus cues, large field of view, compact optics, and robust eye box that holography promises. A program director may ask why the market needs a fragile, holographic path when conventional displays keep improving. The answer is not to insult incumbents. The answer is to name the different value proposition. Holography is attractive because it can control wavefronts and depth cues in ways conventional flat panel architectures struggle to match. But holography earns that attraction only if its own fragility is solved. Prolog. Attacks one fragility point: camera in the loop. Neural holography is another adjacent family. These systems use measured optical feedback to improve displayed holograms by correcting for real system behavior. They are relevant because they already blur the line between optics and learned correction. Prolog's distinction, again, has to be narrow. Camera-in-the-loop calibration often improves a model of a particular setup or content generation pipeline. Prolog's claim is blind in use correction of a drifting disorder-based operator at display relevant rate under injected head-worn perturbations with compact drift state estimation rather than full remeasurement. Time multiplexed neural holography and fast, heavily quantized spatial light modulators add another nearby rote. They use temporal degrees of freedom and algorithmic optimization to improve holographic quality under hardware constraints. This matters because Prolog also lives under a time budget. But time multiplexing is not the same as operator survival. It changes how holograms are synthesized or displayed. Prolog changes how the display remains calibrated to its own shifting optical state. This repeated distinction may sound obsessive. It is necessary. Novelty in a crowded technical field is not one grand border. It is a set of narrow borders defended consistently. The applicant must be able to say that work improves expansion, that work improves pupil robustness, that work improves learned optical elements, that work improves hologram optimization, that work improves imaging through scattering, and this project tests in use survival of a drifting disorder operator. The prior art section should also acknowledge a danger. Some prior work already evaluates robustness to pupil changes. Some learned expanders report performance across eye pupil positions and sizes. A director could use that to challenge Prolog's pupil-related contribution. The answer is to concede the overlap and restrict the claim. Prolog is not first to care about pupil movement. Prolog is using pupil-equivalent offsets as one component of a broader optical drift envelope involving mask, modulator, relay optics, and thermal-like shifts. The novelty lives in combined operator drift tracking, not in the mere mention of the pupil. This is how the map should sound. Respect every ancestor. Shrink the claim until it becomes hard, then defend that hard small thing completely. The prior art section must be generous because generosity protects the novelty claim. ay-tahn-doo expansion for holographic near-eye displays is already an active research area. Neural ay-tahn-doo expanders use learned optical elements to push diffraction angles and field of view beyond the limits of conventional modulators. Pupil-aware holography addresses the fact that the viewer's pupil samples only part of the optical field and that pupil changes affect perceived quality. Camera-calibrated neural holography and time-multiplexed systems improve reconstruction through measured propagation models, hardware-aware solvers, and fast spatial light modulators. Dynamic Fourier modulation approaches attack the field of view and eye box trade-off through optical and computational design. Wavefront shaping through scattering media is another ancestor, but it is not the same creature. Guide star-free and image-guided approaches show that useful corrections can sometimes be recovered without a planted reference point, and that image quality feedback can guide a wavefront correction through disorder. That literature gives Prolog a conceptual license to treat scattering as a controllable medium rather than a defect. But the target domain differs. The scattering medium in Prolog is part of the display's own optical train, and the task is not to see through biological tissue or a hidden object. The task is to maintain a projected holographic reconstruction, while the display operator itself drifts. The closest threats are therefore not generic AR headsets. The closest threats are systems that already combine learned optics, pupil-aware reconstruction, camera-in-the-loop calibration, and ay-tahn-doo expansion. The defense must admit that those systems may achieve impressive static reconstructions, wide field demonstrations, or improved perceptual depth cues. Then it must ask the harder question: which of them makes in use survival of a drifting disorder-based operator, the central experimental object with an injected head-worn drift envelope, compact drift state recovery, sparse feedback, display rate, update, and perceptual artifact limits? That question is the map. Prior art shows why the project is plausible. It does not remove the whole. The whole is calibration survival under realistic motion for disorder-based holography. If the applicant says prior art did not solve anything, the applicant sounds uninformed. If the applicant says prior art solved static expansion and high-quality reconstruction, but did not close this drift survival loop, the applicant sounds ready. The differentiation is not that Prolog uses holography. It is not that Prolog uses a scatter mask. It is not that Prolog cares about ay-tahn-doo. It is not that Prolog uses feedback. Each of those moves has ancestors. The differentiation is calibration, survival, under-in-use, operator drift. That phrase has to be defended word by word. Calibration means there is an initial relationship between the modulator, mask, optics, pupil, and reconstruction. Survival means the relationship remains usable after the device leaves its static state. In use means the correction is not a bench procedure performed before or after the relevant experience. Operator drift means the changing object is not merely the displayed image or the user's content. The physical mapping itself changes. The one-breath sentence for the call is this: Prolog is not another ay-tahn-doo expander. It is a blind-in-use calibration survival layer that estimates a compact correction to the drifting scattering operator and resolves the hologram against the current operator within a display rate budget. That is the sentence. Memorize its pressure points. Not another ay-tahn-doo expander. Blind-in-use calibration survival layer. Compact correction. Drifting scattering operator. Current operator. Display rate budget. If the director says, how is this different from Kuo and the scattering mask literature, the answer is structural. That literature shows how a characterized scattering element can expand ay-tahn-doo and support dense imagery. Prolog asks how to keep that characterization valid when the mask, modulator, relay optics, and pupil move relative to one another under head-worn drift. The novelty is not the static mask. The novelty is the survival loop. If the director says, how is this different from neural ay-tahn-doo expanders, the answer is structural. Learned expanders improve the optical element and the nominal reconstruction. Prolog can, in principle, complement such elements because it addresses drift in the live operator. A better element does not eliminate the need to know what operator exists after thermal shift, flex, or pupil equivalent offset. If the director says, how is this different from pupil-aware holography, the answer is structural. Pupil-aware holography optimizes reconstructions against pupil sampling effects. Prolog treats pupil equivalent offset as one part of a broader physical drift state and estimates corrections from incomplete feedback during use. Pupil awareness is a component of robustness. Operator tracking is the broader mechanism. If the director says, how is this different from guide star-free wavefront shaping, the answer is structural. Guide star-free imaging methods seek to recover images through scattering media. Prolog uses scattering inside the display and tries to preserve a projected hologram as its own optical train changes. The task is not seeing through disorder. The task is computing through changing disorder quickly enough for display use. That is how to avoid generic novelty language. Do not say the project is innovative because it combines optics and computation. That sentence could describe half the field. Do not say it is unique because it uses AI or adaptive calibration. The pitch does not need that fog. Say the exact missing mechanism. The commercial differentiation follows the same logic. The beachhead is not the consumer headset. It is the integration layer that optical module teams need when they ask whether disorder-based holography can leave the bench. The deliverables are the estimator, the compact drift state representation, the feedback schedule, the update rule, the drift characterization data, and a reference integration package. The customer is the team trying to decide whether a scatter-based or diffractive mask-based holographic architecture can survive realistic motion. The risk is high because as advanced display laboratories are well-funded, that concession is useful. The pitch should not pretend that the field is empty. It is not empty. Meta, Princeton, Stanford, adjacent display groups, Carnegie Mellon, Technion, NVIDIA affiliated research, and major optical module teams all move in nearby territory. Prolog's wedge has to be narrow enough to defend. That wedge is not content, not headset branding, not cinematic production, not a general AR platform. It is calibration survival for a drifting disorder-based holographic display. There is another differentiation that matters for NSF. The project has research failure modes rather than product milestones dressed as research. Objective 1 is observability. Objective 2 is display rate computation. Objective 3 is perceptual sufficiency under continuous re-estimation. These are not sales tasks. They are scientific and engineering unknowns. The phrase, protectable technical result, should also be spoken carefully. The protectable result is not a screenshot of a hologram. It is the method and data around survival, drift, state representation, feedback schedule, estimator update rule, and drift characterization under injected motion. That is where intellectual property can live, because it is where the field's bench-to-worn gap lives. A weak applicant says, "We are making better holographic displays." A stronger applicant says, "We are testing whether a compact operator drift model can be estimated from sparse feedback quickly enough to preserve reconstruction quality under a head-worn drift envelope." The second sentence is less glamorous. It is far more dangerous in a good way. It gives the director something precise to attack, and therefore something precise to respect. The structural difference is the loop under drift. Everything else is supporting architecture. The differentiation must also avoid the word adaptive as a hiding place. Adaptive can mean anything from a lookup table to a feedback controller to a learned optimizer. The director will not fund a foggy adjective. Prolog's adaptive element has named parts: a drift state representation, a feedback schedule, an estimator update rule, a hologram correction step, a validation protocol. Those names turn adaptation from mood into mechanism. There is a second phrase to avoid overusing: real time. Real time by itself is vague. 33 milliseconds after initialization is stronger. It creates a test. It also creates a business boundary. If the loop cannot run within that budget on the Phase 1 compute stack, then integration support for optical module teams becomes premature. The applicant should speak in timing constraints, not in speed adjectives. The differentiation should also be separated from Pulchritude's media identity. The company's generative film and localization pipeline explains why immersive display quality matters to Pulchritude. It is an internal content driver, not the technical novelty. A program director funding AV, VR, and MR display research will not award a pitch because the company makes media. The company has to show why its content ambitions create customer insight, while the research team supplies the photonics and computational imaging depth. The novelty remains the calibration survival layer. This separation protects the story. Pulchritude can be a media company with a credible deep tech project only if the project is scoped with scientific discipline and executed by a PhD-led team. The pitch does that by naming roles matched to failure modes. The principal investigator handles company execution, customer discovery, commercialization, integration, and the connection to immersive content. The technical leads cover optical sciences, electrical and optical engineering, applied mathematics, computer science, vision science, and optomechanical engineering. That is a defense against the obvious credibility attack. The structural difference can be turned into a hierarchy of claims. The broad field claim is that holographic near-eye displays need larger ay-tahn-doo, correct focus cues, compact optics, and robustness to pupil and device variation. The prior art claim is that many methods address parts of that problem through masks, learned elements, pupil-aware optimization, multiple sources, or wavefront shaping. The Prolog claim is that a disorder-based display also needs in use survival of its own operator when head-worn drift changes calibration. The Phase 1 claim is that this survival can be tested through compact drift estimation from incomplete feedback inside a 33 millisecond correction budget and judged against fixed calibration on held-out scenes. That hierarchy prevents the applicant from sounding as if they invented holography. They did not. It lets them sound as if they found a necessary missing layer. That is exactly the posture. One more defense matters. The method is potentially complementary to strong prior art. If neural ay-tahn-doo expanders produce better static optical elements, Prolog can still matter when those elements are built into worn systems that drift. If pupil-aware holography improves robustness to eye sampling, Prolog can still matter when multiple components shift and the current operator departs from calibration. Complementarity is not weakness. It is often how licensing becomes plausible. A module team does not need to throw away its optical architecture to value a calibration survival layer. The one-breath sentence should therefore not be treated as a slogan. It is a compressed claim chart. Prolog is not another ay-tahn-doo expander. It is a blind-in-use calibration survival layer that estimates a compact correction to the drifting scattering operator and re-solves the hologram against the current operator within a display rate budget. If every word in that sentence survives questioning, the pitch has a spine. The differentiation has to be structural, not adjectival. Prolog is not differentiated because it is more advanced, more immersive, or more ambitious. Those words are weak under review. It is differentiated because the unit of novelty is the in-use operator correction loop. Static ay-tahn-doo expansion asks whether a designed optical element can enlarge angular support while preserving image quality under a known setup. Prolog asks whether the setup can be treated as time-varying and corrected without full remeasurement. That changes the experimental object. The protectable pieces named in the project document should appear directly in the lecture and slide plan: drift, state representation, feedback schedule, estimator update rule, and drift characterization data. Each one is a defensible asset only if it is tied to measurable performance. A drift representation is not valuable because it is elegant. It is valuable if it captures the physical perturbations that dominate reconstruction error. A feedback schedule is not valuable because it is clever. It is valuable if it makes the relevant degrees of freedom observable within a limited measurement budget. An estimator update rule is not valuable because it uses modern optimization. It is valuable if it improves held-out drifted scenes inside the timing budget. Drift characterization data is not valuable because it fills a database. It is valuable if optical module teams can use it to decide what designs can survive where. The cleanest defense line is this: prior art expands or optimizes holographic reconstruction under an assumed or separately calibrated operator. Prolog studies the survival of that operator assumption after the device enters a head-worn drift regime. That is not a larger claim. It is a narrower one. Narrowness is the source of strength. This section should also guard against overclaim. Prolog is not a complete headset, not a content deployment platform, not a promise of full-color consumer display, and not a claim that rigid optomechanics are useless. It is a research layer that may become necessary if disorder-based holographic near-eye displays are to leave the bench. That phrasing puts the project in the right category: enabling technology for display teams, not consumer electronics theater. The director's first question will be blunt. Why is this not just scattering-based ay-tahn-doo expansion with a little adaptive calibration bolted on? The answer should not dodge. Scattering-based ay-tahn-doo expansion is the immediate ancestor, and Prolog depends on the same premise that a disorder element can be useful if its optical action is known. The difference is the failure condition. Prior scattering-based expansion demonstrates reconstruction against a characterized operator. Prolog tests. Whether that operator can be tracked after head-worn drift changes the relationship among the spatial light, modulator, mask, relay optics, and pupil. The adaptive part is not a bolt-on, it is the research mechanism. If the compact drift state is not observable from sparse feedback, or if the update misses the 33 millisecond budget, the project fails. Second question: sparse feedback sounds underdetermined. How will you know the estimator is tracking physical drift rather than chasing scene-dependent image error or speckle? The answer is to point to the experimental design. Phase 1 separates those cases using held-out scenes, held-out drift states, intermittent full characterization, and predefined drift injections. The estimator is not allowed to fit on the held-out scenes. It must predict operator behavior against full characterization on held-out drift states with normalized prediction error, no more than 0.20. The drift envelope is physically injected through lateral shifts, angular shifts, pupil-equivalent offsets, and thermal-like sweeps. If it only improves the images it saw, that is not success. If it cannot distinguish drift from content, Objective 1 fails. Third question: why should NSF believe the correction can run at display rate? Full inverse solves are slow and fast approximations can track the wrong thing. The answer is that this is Objective 2, not an assumption. The project compares the incremental blind update against fixed calibration, periodic remeasurement, and offline camera in the loop baselines. After initialization, the operator update plus hologram correction must finish within 33 milliseconds on the Phase 1 compute stack. It also has to improve held-out drifted scenes by at least 3 decibels in PSNR, or reduce normalized mean squared error by at least 25% relative to fixed calibration. A result that is beautiful and late fails. A result that is fast and visually weak fails. The claim needs both timing and reconstruction gain. Fourth question: what if tracking restores the image metric but creates temporal shimmer or speckle that a user cannot tolerate? The answer is Objective 3. Prolog does not equate tracking with perceptual success. The closed-loop reconstruction must maintain structural similarity index at or above 0.85, or a pre-registered optical reconstruction metric, while residual speckle contrast and temporal artifact measures remain below pre-registered perceptual limits. The project names the risk that mathematical correction can produce perceptual ugliness. If the image remains nervous under continuous re-estimation, the mechanism is not sufficient for display use. Fifth question: where is the company credible? Pulchritude Studios is a generative film and media company, not an established optical hardware lab. Why should this team execute a Photonics heavy Phase 1? The answer must be direct. Pulchritude owns the company side: execution, budget, schedule, integration, customer discovery, commercialization, and the link to immersive content needs. The technical execution is PhD-led and matched to failure modes. Optical sciences covers computational holography, wavefront shaping, propagation modeling, scatter mask physics, and drift definitions. Optical engineering covers the spatial light modulator, mask, feedback sensor, actuated drift stage, and reference calibration. Applied mathematics covers blind operator estimation, observability, drift state representation, and metrics. Computer science and electrical engineering cover the GPU and FPGA implementation, latency profiling, and baseline solvers. Vision science covers speckle, temporal artifacts, held-out scenes, and perceptual thresholds. Optomechanical engineering covers thermal and mechanical drift envelopes, face fit and pupil equivalent perturbations, and repeatable injected drift. The company is not pretending the founder alone is the optical bench. It is assembling the team around the failure modes. Now the full exchange, end to end. Program director. I understand scattering masks. I understand holography. I understand calibration. Why is this NSF research and not normal engineering integration? Applicant. Because the unknown is not whether calibration can be performed on a bench. The unknown is whether the current scattering operator can be inferred from incomplete feedback after realistic head-worn drift, and whether that correction can be used inside the display timing budget without creating perceptual artifacts. The project has 3 falsifiable research claims: observability under sparse feedback, 33 millisecond closed loop correction, and image cleanliness under continuous re-estimation. Program director. What is the hardest technical risk? Applicant. Observability. The feedback is confounded by scene content, speckle, pupil position, and sensor noise. That is why Objective 1 compares the compact correction against intermittent full characterization on held-out drift states, and why held-out scenes are not used for fitting. If the estimator cannot separate physical drift from scene-dependent error, the project fails early and cleanly. Program director. Suppose Objective 1 works. Why would anyone license this instead of using better mechanical packaging? Applicant. Rigid packaging reduces drift, but does not remove all thermal shift, face fit motion, vibration, or pupil equivalent change in a head-worn device. Prolog is valuable, where the display team wants the ay-tahn-doo advantages of disorder-based holography without depending on a once-measured operator remaining fixed. The product is not a headset. It is an IP-backed calibration survival layer, validation dataset, and reference integration package for optical module teams. Program director. What would make you stop? Applicant. 3 results. If normalized prediction error stays above 0.20 against held-out drift states, the operator correction is not identifiable enough. If update plus correction exceeds 33 milliseconds after initialization, the method is not display relevant. If structural similarity or the pre-registered optical metric passes while speckle and temporal artifacts exceed perceptual limits, then the estimator is mathematically interesting but insufficient for a display. Those are stop points, not excuses. This is how the applicant survives the call. Do not oversell. Do not hide prior art. Do not answer with adjectives. Answer with mechanism, metric, baseline, and failure mode. The program director is not the enemy. The director is the instrument that reveals whether the idea has bones. Another likely question is about data rights and defensibility. What prevents a large display lab from doing the same thing once the problem is named? The answer should avoid pretending that large labs lack talent. They have talent. The defensible wedge is the combination of drift characterization data, compact operator models, feedback schedules, estimator update rules, and integration know-how specific to disorder-based holographic near-eye displays under injected head-worn drift. Phase 1 should produce not only a model, but a body of measured behavior under controlled perturbations. That data can become part of the moat because it teaches which drift modes matter, which feedback signals observe them, and which corrections stay perceptually clean. The director may ask whether the validation data set is itself enough of a product. The answer is no, not alone. The beachhead package is method plus data plus reference integration. Data without a correction loop is consulting material. A correction loop without validation data is a fragile claim. Reference integration without either is product theater. The commercial unit is the bundle. Another question, why not use direct sensors for every drift mode? Put encoders, thermistors, eye tracking, and mechanical sensors everywhere. The answer should concede that hardware sensing can help. Prolog does not need to deny sensors. The research question is whether sparse optical feedback can estimate a compact correction to the operator without full remeasurement. Direct sensors may become auxiliary channels in later integration, but they do not replace the need to know the optical effect of drift. A temperature sensor tells you temperature. It does not by itself tell you the corrected scattering operator. An eye tracker tells you pupil position. It does not by itself solve the changed wavefront transformation. Prolog's value is in mapping evidence to optical correction. Another question, what happens when the drift leaves the compact model's family? The answer is that the system should detect degradation rather than hallucinate control. Phase 1 should report boundary conditions. If drift exceeds the modeled envelope or produces unmodeled deformation, the corrected reconstruction should fail in a detectable way. That is not a reason to hide the problem. It is a reason to build confidence measures and escalation paths, such as requesting remeasurement or falling back to a safer display mode in later products. Phase 1 does not need to solve every out-of-envelope case. It needs to define the envelope it can survive. Another question: how will you prevent the work from becoming a content demo for Pulchritude rather than a display technology result? The answer is scope discipline. The source explicitly excludes content deployment. The held-out scenes are test stimuli, not a launch library. Pulchritude's internal content pipeline supplies motivation for natural focus, immersive imagery, but Phase 1 success is judged by operator prediction, timing, reconstruction improvement, and artifact limits. The company story supports commercialization. It does not replace the technical evidence. The final question may be the quietest. Why now? The answer is that the field has matured enough for the gap to matter. Holographic near-eye displays have credible prototypes. Ay-tahn-doo expansion has credible mask-based, phase-based, learned, and multi-source routes. Pupil effects are recognized. Camera-calibrated and neural holography have improved reconstruction quality. As soon as the field tries to leave the bench, calibration survival becomes a bottleneck. Prolog is timed to that transition, not to a fantasy of starting the field from zero. A good gauntlet does not make the project look invulnerable. It makes it look difficult in the right way. The applicant walks into the call already knowing where the knives are. That is the point. The gauntlet becomes stronger when every answer carries a measurement. The program director asks, what is the closest prior art? The answer should not dodge. The closest prior art includes learned and scattering-based ay-tahn-doo expansion, pupil-aware holography, camera-calibrated neural holography, dynamic Fourier modulation, and GuideStar-free wavefront shaping. Prolog differs because it centers a drifting disorder-based display operator under injected head, worn perturbations and tests. Whether sparse feedback can recover a compact correction fast enough to improve held-out reconstructions. The director asks, why should sparse feedback identify the operator rather than just the image? The answer is that Phase 1 is designed around observability, not vibes. Feedback patterns, scene holdouts, intermittent full characterization, and drift state parameterization are used to test whether the estimator predicts held-out drift states rather than overfitting visible content. If normalized prediction error exceeds 0.20, the claim fails. The director asks, why not solve this with better packaging? The answer is that packaging remains important, but it is not a complete scientific answer for disorder-based holography. Rigid packaging tries to prevent drift. Prolog tests whether the residual drift that remains in worn use can be estimated and corrected. The two are not enemies. Packaging reduces the disturbance. Calibration survival handles the disturbance that survives packaging. The director asks, why is 33 milliseconds credible? The answer is that the project does not budget for full transmission matrix remeasurement. It tests reduced order, incremental operator updates, and hologram correction against rate constraints on the Phase 1 compute stack. If the fast approximation cannot beat fixed calibration while meeting the timing budget, Objective 2 fails. That answer is stronger than pretending latency is an implementation detail. The director asks, what proves the image is usable? The answer is that geometry alone is not enough. Held-out static and dynamic scenes are evaluated against a static bench reference, while speckle contrast and temporal artifacts are constrained by pre-registered perceptual limits. If tracking restores a metric while making the image shimmer, Objective 3 fails. This is how the applicant shows scientific seriousness. By naming the ways, success can become false success. The final director question is commercial. Why would anyone license this? The answer is that optical module developers and headset teams need correct focus cues, wide field of view, compact optics, and methods that survive wear. Prolog does not sell a headset. It sells an integration path, validation data, and intellectual property around calibration survival for teams evaluating disorder-based holography. The business claim stands only if the Phase 1 mechanism stands. Return now to the first question. Is an appearance still an appearance when the apparatus that makes it trembles? The naive answer was yes, if the image still looks good. The scientific answer is stricter. It is yes only if the relation that produces the image can be maintained under the relevant motion of the apparatus. The appearance is not saved by rhetoric. It is saved by operator tracking. That changes the philosophy. Plato's cave makes appearance subordinate to the stable form beyond it. Prolog's problem lives in a different age. The form is not elsewhere. The form is a live relation among a modulator, a scatter or diffractive mask, relay optics, a pupil feedback channel, an estimator, and a solver. Stability is not given. It is performed by correction. Simondon would be useful here because he understood technical objects as things that individuate through internal relations rather than as dead tools pasted onto human life. A mature technical object is not merely a collection of parts. Its parts become mutually adapted. The cooling system serves the engine serves the structure serves the mode of operation. Prolog's calibration survival layer is a step toward that kind of individuation for disorder-based holographic displays. The display would no longer be a static optical arrangement that computation uses from outside. It would be a system that senses enough of its own drift to keep its optical function alive. Say it simply, the display has to know when it is no longer the display it was. That is why the pitch is strongest when it resists product fantasy. It does not need to claim the whole future of AR, VR, and MR. It needs to claim the bottleneck that prevents a specific class of future display from leaving the bench. If disorder-based ay-tahn-doo expansion is part of the path to compact holographic displays with correct focus cues and wide field of view, then calibration survival is not a luxury. It is the difference between a demonstration and a device. The closing image is not a headset in a commercial. It is a hologram under stress. The stage warms, the mask shifts, the pupil moves, the old operator fails. A fixed calibration reconstructs yesterday's truth and produces today's artifact. Prolog watches the error, estimates the compact drift, updates the operator, resolves the hologram, and asks the eye to judge again. If the image stays clean, the project has answered the old question in the only language optics respects. Appearance is not lesser being when it is disciplined by mechanism. It becomes a contract kept in light. There is a theological shadow here too, if it is kept as thought history rather than doctrine. Apophatic theology says that the highest truths can sometimes be approached by saying what cannot be said, by refusing false possession. Prolog's technical discipline has a similar negative honesty. It knows what it is not. It is not a consumer headset. It is not full-color industrial design. It is not a content deployment platform. It is not a claim that prior holographic display work failed. It is not a claim that a static mask is new. It is not a claim that feedback by itself is new. By removing those false claims, the true claim becomes visible. A drifting optical operator can perhaps be tracked in use through a compact correction estimated from sparse feedback, fast enough to preserve a holographic reconstruction under a head-worn drift envelope. That is the whole cathedral stone by stone. If Phase 1 succeeds, the result is not final victory. It is permission to proceed. It tells optical module teams that disorder-based holography may have a survival mechanism beyond rigid packaging and repeated bench calibration. It gives them drift characterization data, a reference integration path, and a way to ask better product questions. What sensors are worth adding? What mask designs are more trackable? What drift modes dominate? What compute stack is sufficient? What image metrics predict perceptual comfort? Those are the next questions success would open. If Phase 1 fails, the failure can still teach. If incomplete feedback cannot identify the operator, then the system needs richer feedback or different sensing. If computation misses the timing budget, then the estimator or solver has to be simplified or accelerated. If perceptual artifacts remain, then the objective function or display architecture needs revision. The field benefits from knowing which door is locked. This is why the closing line cannot be a sales promise. The moral of the lecture is not that Prolog will transform AR. The moral is that the image has to earn the right to be trusted while the device is moving. In the pitch call, that distinction matters. A program director has heard too many futures. The director is listening for a mechanism that can be killed by evidence. Prolog offers one. Think again of the user, not as a market segment, but as a biological optical endpoint. The eye is not impressed by the startup category. The eye receives light. It accommodates. It samples through a pupil that shifts. It notices shimmer before language does. It rejects the image before the wearer knows why. A display that wants to place objects into lived space has to respect that silent tribunal. The apparatus trembles. That is not a defect in the story. It is the condition of reality. Every worn device trembles, warms, shifts, ages, and meets bodies that were not machined to tolerance. The fantasy is not the hologram. The fantasy is the assumption that calibration remains sovereign after contact. Prolog's answer is humbler and stronger. Calibration is not a throne. It is a living treaty. A treaty can be broken. It can also be renewed. Each frame becomes a renewal if the system can estimate enough of its drift, correct enough of its operator, and deliver enough clean light before the eye loses trust. That is the philosophical return. Appearance is not condemned because it is made. It is judged by the discipline of its making. So the trembling image is not the failure of holography. It is the test that separates bench spectacle from display technology. When the light still holds under motion, the appearance has passed through the gauntlet and come back with authority. The hologram becomes real enough for engineering when it survives the hand that wears it. The return also clarifies the role of beauty. Pulchritude means beauty, and the company name could tempt the pitch toward aesthetic language. But the beauty that matters here is not surface polish. It is the beauty of a system whose parts answer each other under stress. A clean reconstruction under drift is beautiful because it is earned. The modulator, mask, relay optics, feedback sensor, estimator, solver, and perceptual limits all participate in the same held relation. That is the kind of beauty an engineer can defend. Not beauty as taste, beauty as coherence. There is a final adversarial lesson. The program director's skepticism is not an obstacle to the project. It is the form the project needs. Without the director, the applicant may keep the story too wide. With the director, the story narrows until it becomes fundable or breaks. What is new? What is measured? What fails? What is excluded? What prior art is closest? What sentence survives in one breath? The gauntlet is not a punishment, it is a shaping tool. The applicant who leaves this lecture should feel the difference between confidence and performance. Performance says, this is revolutionary. Confidence says, the closest prior art proves static and learned ay-tahn-doo expansion, pupil-aware optimization, and wavefront shaping through scattering media. Prolog tests the missing survival layer for a drifting disorder-based holographic operator under head-worn perturbations with name metrics and stop points. One of those sentences is loud. The other is hard to knock down. That is the closing discipline. Build the claim so it can stand quietly. The opening question asked whether appearance remains appearance when the apparatus trembles. The answer is not simply yes. The answer is conditional. Yes, if the display can recognize enough of its own trembling to correct the wavefront before the eye receives the failure. Yes, if the correction is fast enough. Yes, if the result stays clean enough. Yes, if the image is judged against held-out drift, held-out scenes and perceptual limits, rather than against the memory of a beautiful bench demo. That conditional yes is the strongest answer Prolog can give. It is not a prophecy. It is a research program. The cathedral builders knew that light needed structure to become meaning. Modern holography knows that light needs computation to become depth. Prolog adds a third requirement. In a worn device, light needs self-correction to remain trustworthy. And that brings the old cave to a strange reversal. The problem is no longer that humans mistake shadows for reality. The problem is that a machine must work hard enough for its shadows to deserve belief. That belief is never total. It is always provisional, always renewed. The point of the technology is not to erase mediation, but to make mediation answerable. The eye receives an image. The instrument receives evidence of its own drift. The computation receives a corrected state. The next wavefront carries that correction forward. A living chain, not a frozen trick. That is the final memory hook for the applicant. Do not defend the hologram as a miracle. Defend it as a maintained relation. When pressed, return to the relation. Modulator to mask. Mask to relay optics. Optics to pupil. Pupil to feedback. Feedback to drift state. Drift state to hologram. Hologram back to the eye. The return should make the technical and philosophical meanings coincide. The display begins as a promise that light can be arranged into depth. The project turns that promise into a conditional engineering statement. A holographic appearance can remain trustworthy under motion only if the system can estimate enough of its current optical state, compute a correction quickly enough, and keep the residual artifacts below the perceptual threshold of the eye. The academic lesson is that calibration is not a past event. In a worn disorder-based holographic display, calibration becomes a continuing relation between hardware, feedback, computation, and perception. The old bench calibration is still necessary, but it is no longer sovereign. It is the initial condition of a process. The system has to carry that initial condition into a changing optical present. That is a deeper ending than saying the project makes AR better. It says the boundary between display and instrument has changed. The display is no longer only a surface that emits content. It is a scientific instrument pointed at itself, constantly asking whether the optical model it believes in is still the model through which light is traveling. This self-interrogation is the bridge from bench spectacle to head-worn technology. The closing should leave the listener with one defensible sentence for the pitch call. Prolog tests. Whether a disorder-based holographic near-eye display can survive realistic head-worn drift by estimating a compact correction to its own optical operator from sparse feedback and re-solving the hologram within a display rate timing budget. That is the sentence. Everything else supports it, and the final image remains precise. The apparatus trembles, the old operator decays, the feedback returns evidence, the estimator updates the state, the solver corrects the wavefront, the eye receives the next reconstruction. Trust is not assumed, it is earned again, frame by frame.